Hello and welcome. I'm Becky with Move Minneapolis, and it's noon, so we're just about to kick off this webinar. We're just letting a few more people trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, hello and welcome to today's Move Minneapolis webinar on school transportation. I'm your host, Becky Alper, Outreach Director at Move Minneapolis, and I am thrilled to kick off what surely will be a lively discussion on getting to school safely and sustainably during a pandemic. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Please keep in mind that this webinar is not about in-school COVID safety, nor is it about the decision to reopen school buildings to in-person instruction. So school transportation, it's a relatively new area for Move Minneapolis, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our group of panelists in just a few minutes. Before we get into today's topic, I have a few things to share with you today. First, Move Minneapolis is a transportation management organization serving the city of Minneapolis with a special focus on downtown employers and commuters. Our purpose is to reduce transportation emissions, and we do that by concentrating on decreasing drive-alone trips. We also consult on commuter benefits, transit, shared mobility options, and biking and walking. This past year, we've taken most of our events virtual, and I would like to invite you to consider joining us for our Move with Move Yoga and Transportation History series. We're 2 sessions in and have 6 more to go. And Alex will drop a direct link into the chat if you'd like to register. All right, speaking of the chat, please know that we want you to ask questions. You're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A. If it makes sense, we'll take these questions during our conversation, but don't feel you need to wait until we officially open it up to put your questions in the chat. And we'll take as many questions as we can, so please don't hold back. So to set the scene, I want to share my journey to today's topic. I have a first grader in Minneapolis Public Schools, and last year, in the midst of distance learning, I tuned in to a district meeting that reported back results from a parent survey. And my eye was immediately struck by the slide on transportation preferences, indicating that over half of kids would be driven to school if in-person or hybrid instruction was resumed. In my mind, I pictured a tsunami of cars on the road to school in the midst of the pandemic, with schools becoming these centers of air pollution due to parent drop-off, not to mention the physical safety issues and traffic congestion caused from having so many cars around schools. But was this tsunami a true potential? And was it inevitable? Thanks to lots of conversations I had with local experts, I was able to dig deeper into the data, and I found that 50 years ago, the vast majority of kids in the US walked or biked to school. Check out this graph showing 1969 data in the back and 2009 data in the front with the different options for getting to school. From left to right, we have walking and biking, the school bus, family vehicle, and public transit. So if that tsunami really was coming, the only means of transportation to school category that could stand to lose any more percentage points was the school bus. And I found this alarming. So that brings us up to our pre-pandemic state of affairs, where the percentage of kids driven to school nationally has risen even more since 2009 to 54% in 2017. And unfortunately, in Minneapolis and in Minnesota as a whole, we don't really have the data to know how we compare to those national figures, if we're doing better or we're doing worse. But we do know one thing, and that is that we cannot afford to make driving to school any more permanent or any more the norm than it already is. If we care about the health of our kids, the health of our society, and the health of our planet. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our three great panelists who are working to make these other options available, reliable, safe, both COVID safe and safe in terms of physical safety and easy to use. So I'm going to invite them up on the screen to join me on video. And first up, we have Ale. Ale is Transportation Project Coordinator for Minneapolis Public Schools. Prior to her joining her current district role, she spent 6 years on the ground in school transportation at Emerson Elementary School, including on-site traffic management during a major school expansion project. So welcome, Ale. Thanks for joining us today. We also have Tom Temke from Voight's Bus. Tom is the safety and compliance officer there. It's a school bus and motor coach transportation company in the Twin Cities market. And I absolutely loved that he started out as a school bus driver himself while studying political science at the University of Minnesota. So welcome to the conversation, Tom. And last but certainly not least is Amy Morgan. She's an associate transportation planner with the City of Minneapolis. And as part of her work, she's involved with the Safe Routes to School work group in partnership with Minneapolis Public Schools. So with that, a warm welcome to all of our panelists today. Thank you for joining us. You can take yourself off of mute, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which hopefully I did successfully. And so welcome to all of you. I want to get started with a really easy question. Hopefully this is really easy. And let's see. So how did you get to school when you were in elementary and high school? And is this typical now? Or how have things changed? And feel free, we can all, anyone can kick us off.
Well, I'll start. So I actually grew up in St. Paul, and my elementary school I was able to walk to. It was about a block and a half from home. So I would walk to elementary school with school crossing guards. And so then for high school, it was almost 2 miles from my house, and I would take the city bus there. And because it was underneath the 2 mile walking distance, busing distance for high school. So I would take the city bus to high school. And I had a good experience all around, walking to school in elementary and taking the city bus in high school. And one of the nice things about taking the city bus in high school was I was on track and cross country. And so after practice, I could take the bus home. And so that was an advantage at high school.
Then. Yeah.
What's that?
You were more independent. It made you independent.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. What about you, Amy or Ali?
Can jump in. So I'm actually originally from Mexico. I was born and raised. I moved to Minneapolis about 10 years ago. Schools that did not provide transportation, public or private. So essentially, the only source of transportation, it was either your family or public transportation. Those were the only options. Now, there is private companies that provide transportation for families, not schools. So you have to hire someone that will pick up your student from school or to school. And families have to pay for that service. Essentially just how families have changed from maybe one parent staying at home, then now to the two parents working and have to find another source of transportation. Also, there was a practice of parents organizing in the neighborhood just to kind of picking up a group of kids every day. Parents will rotate, and still is a practice just to kind of avoid the long queues for the drop-off and pick up locations at schools. So it was very challenging to figure out the transportation here in the U.S. particularly here in Minneapolis, even for myself, I'm just trying to figure out the public transportation system, how to dress properly. For winter, I had no idea you had to dress differently. And just figuring out the times and how to pay, or so I find transportation challenging when you come from a different country and you move into the US, at least in my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think yeah, thanks for sharing that. What about you, Amy?
Yeah, I in elementary school, middle school, I took the bus to school, but in high school, I actually lived outside of my high school boundary by 1 block. And so I was either driven or drove myself to school. I grew up in the Robbinsdale, first ring suburbs of the city, for those who are familiar with Minneapolis. And it's definitely is and was a very car-oriented community. And so transportation, that kind of was your option unless you're getting bused to school. Since then, I moved into the city core of Minneapolis, lived in downtown Cincinnati, living without a car. I realized just how much freedom you have by taking either transit or biking, not having to worry about parking a car somewhere or dealing with all of that. And so my perspective has definitely shifted a lot since those years. And I now either take the bus or bike to work when we are in the office.
Yeah. Great. So, a lot has changed in this last year. And in March of 2020, in our field, working primarily with commuters, so office workers in downtown, is a big population for us. We noticed this huge shift to remote work. I mean, 3 out of 4 of us right now are sitting at home, even though Tom is not at home, he's in his office. It sort of looks like you could be at home.
Very homey.
Yes, very homey. And we, across the US, there was this huge shift to remote work, an 8-fold increase, just enormous. And it happened overnight with people working from home. And it shows no signs currently of slowing from what we've seen as an organization. So I'd love to hear from you. How do you think this trend for remote work for adults, how do you think this impacts school transportation? So, does it cause more parents to drive their kids to school, or what are you seeing or hearing from families and schools? Should we be concerned about a tsunami of cars on the road to school? Take it away, any of you.
I'll hop in briefly. I know I talked to some staff in our traffic division, and there's been an uptick in 311 calls actually about this issue with increased traffic around schools with people picking up and dropping off. Early on, it was around some private schools that were still doing in-person learning. So I think it's a definite concern moving forward as MPS starts to open up more. And so, it's definitely starting to happen, at least a little bit in some parts of the city.
So Amy, let me ask you, those 311 calls come in, and what's the process that trickles up to you in the as a transportation planner? What's the kind of the route that these take through the city process?
Yeah, so actually a lot of that gets dealt with in our traffic division. There's a group that is particularly working around operations around schools. They do different school audits typically every year. And so they are particularly the ones that are involved in making sure that operations are working correctly and there's no safety concerns around the schools. And so it doesn't, this is just knowledge that I have by talking to some of my coworkers, but it doesn't necessarily trickle up to the infrastructure work that we do per se at this time. And I think, there's a lot that goes into that. This is such a new trend. Is it a temporary trend? Is it going to be a long-term trend? There's tight budgets. Where do you invest that time and staff capacity? And so I think there's a lot of questions and unknowns as we start to get into this too. Yeah,
absolutely. The more I've dug into it, the more questions I have, which is partially why I'm so glad all 3 of you are here today, so I can I can get to ask more of them. What about you, Ali or Tom, thinking about the shift to remote work and where does school transportation fit into that?
I would say I share the same feeling and thoughts of Amy. Just there's a lot of unknowns and how families are going to be choosing whether they want to choose to drive their kids, they want to choose the bus, or they want to keep their kids at home, right? So I can definitely see a shift in families choosing more of a different transportation than the bus, just because I can see the bus numbers on how many students are scheduled to be on the bus, and it's definitely a less than 50% of the numbers that we usually see across the elementary schools that we have open right now. So definitely whether families are choosing to keep their kids at home or have a different source of transportation, whether it's the public transportation or their own vehicle. Definitely we see, and I've heard of more, not traffic issues, but cars among the schools building, whether they're parking or waiting to get through the queue, definitely on those peak times. I don't know how it's going to look when everyone goes back to in-person working or learning.
Yeah, big unknown.
Yeah.
What do you think, Tom?
I do. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And, my company, we serve rural areas and urban areas, and some of the rural areas have been pretty much in continuous, in-person learning versus the urban ones versus, long between distance and hybrid and kind of switching back and forth. So it's a different experience with those, seeing passenger counts staying fairly steady with the rural districts that have stayed open for the most part. Passenger counts on our buses have been very low in general where there's a hybrid model, and it's partly that it's half the students at any given time. So there's that. It's hard to get a good read on this, what it means, how many parents are keeping their kids home in distance learning, even in hybrid model. So there's a lot of it's really difficult, but I am concerned about, and there's some, really good things as we've seen looking at the silver lining to the pandemic is I think many people, many families have kind of come back home in a way, and we've learned, how to spend time together and are valuing that a little more and have changed what we value and trying to slow down, and parents working from home are spending more time with their kids maybe, which are all really good things. I'm just wondering how that translates to when going back to school now. Is it, you know what, I'm going to take the time and drive my child to school versus put them on the school bus because I value that. And it's more time with my child. And as a parent, when I had my teenagers, that time in the car was very valuable to me as a parent because that's when they would talk to me. And it was much harder to pin them down. You'll find this out, Becky. And so anyway, so I wonder, besides the long-term trends since 1969, which we saw on that slide, that it's also just a societal trend that I'm not sure which way this will go when things start to really reopen, which I'm hopeful, assuming it will be this fall, what we'll see then. And I am a little nervous that we'll see continue maybe an accelerated trend away from the school bus, which, I think many people don't realize it's the safest form of transportation on the road for school children by far.
Perfect segue.
Yeah.
Can we get it? Let's talk about safety. I want to talk about, as you started to say, Tom, before I cut you off, just to say about physical safety with these different options for getting to school, different ways. So, and then also I want to talk about COVID safety on the school bus. So, what are the risks, perceived and real, on the school bus, for people driving, and for kids walking and biking? And I can pull up that slide with the documents you sent me, Tom, if you'd like.
If we can pull that up and we can talk both about COVID safety and then also just the safety of the school bus in general outside of pandemic.
Okay. You're gonna have to tell me when you see it. Can you see
Okay,
it?
yep, we're seeing it.
Oh, great. Okay, take it away, Tom, then, and
So-
then everybody else.
And I apologize, this is kind of older data. This is 2005 to 2013, but the trends still hold. And that we see the number of fatalities each year in the United States during school travel hours, 57% are attributed to a teen driver. So it's not really a surprise. 23% to an adult driver, and then other travel would include, taxis and city bus and things like that. School bus is less than 1% of the fatalities, while transporting, I think we saw 39% of the children. So these numbers are kind of sobering when you see that, and see that the school bus is by far the safest way to get your child to and from school. And I'm a parent, I get the concerns around school transportation, and it's not always just physical safety. There's also the emotional safety, well-being, and we know what can happen with a group of students on a bus around bullying and things like that, which need to be addressed. And I think as an industry, we can do a better job of that. I think we've made good progress in training drivers and things like that around, bullying and things like that, and making it a safe environment, both physically and emotionally, for all the children on the bus. But just physically, it is clearly the safest form of transportation. And so it's unfortunate if we start going the other direction, not to mention all the, one school bus can take, easily 30, 35 cars off the road. And what a difference that can make. And we've moved, and I think we'll talk more about this later, that we can move to, we've been moving to cleaner fuels with school buses, and really cleaning the diesel exhaust, adding in propane, unleaded, and now we're starting to see a trend towards electric vehicles. That will only accelerate. And so we're really seeing we can make a big difference, both environmentally, the health of our communities, by people riding the school bus, children riding the school bus.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tom. That was I love their graphics too. What about Amy, Ale? Talk to us more about safety.
I can jump in. I guess safety now, it's a lot different. Just post-COVID, like what safe means is different than what it used to be before, right? Like now safety means that you have to wear a mask. Now safety is that you have to clean highly touched surfaces, or that you have to use hand sanitizer more frequently, or even saying hi now looks different between cultures. Now we can't hug, we can't kiss, we have to maintain our distance. Safety for bus drivers, it's a lot different now. They have to not only control behaviors and being safe with all the environments outside their bus and inside. Now it's reminding students to wear the face mask, making sure they're staying on the assigned seat, have safety, safe protocols for loading and unloading one student at a time. So I guess a lot of the things that, for example, we used to do before without thinking into numbers in space, I can give you a plain example of a practice that we do in Minneapolis is we can provide temporary assignments for students before they get assigned to a route. We're having challenges just communicating that to families that we cannot do that anymore, because we have to take into consideration like numbers of students on the bus, and that could potentially may result in a parent deciding, you know what, I can't wait for that to start. I have to drive my kid to school, or maybe keeping their students at home.
Mm-hmm. And tell me more about I know there's some capacity limits, or I know, Tom, you had mentioned that to me in our conversations before. How does that work? How do routes get planned and assigned? Either of you? Yeah.
Sure. So I can jump in. So routes have a, for Minneapolis, we have a 65% of capacity of scheduling capacity. Then again, we're not sure how many kids that are routed or scheduled are actually in real riding the bus, right? Because there could be a potential of parents deciding to have that schedule. However, they're deciding to drive their kids. So that data, it's kind of unknown at this point, I guess. We are in the practice of constant monitoring of numbers and students, just to figure out if we need more buses, less buses. And then we use several technology in order to plan this, how the information generates from schools, then gets to the scheduling department, looks at the routes, assigns students to the routes, and then essentially once those routes are assigned, they get assigned to the drivers or updates. So it's a whole process of planning, scheduling, and assignments that starts from the schools, essentially.
Wow. Wow. Sounds complex. Tom, tell us about your experience with the route planning piece.
Yeah, and so many of our districts have adopted the, no more than 34 or 35 students on a bus. And when they're talking about a bus, it's about, it's 70 to 78 passenger is a normal full-size school bus, so about half capacity. So that definitely impacts routing during COVID, and that's the hybrid model then works well, where you have half the kids. And it depends, district to district, it can be different, but they can route like 120% above capacity, knowing that X number of students will find another way to school, and then hoping to get as efficient as you can, getting the bus as full as possible. And so, but it kind of varies, and it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. So in Southwest Minneapolis, actually more kids are likely to drive themselves to school, or in some suburban areas and things like that. So you see within a city, and the routers at any given school district will kind of get, the neighborhood, the history in this neighborhood, how many students actually ride, and then you change the percentages. Some neighborhoods you get a lot higher ridership on the bus, just because families don't have a second car, don't have the ability to miss work or anything like that. And so you'll see a difference across socioeconomic groups and neighborhoods, how many students ride the bus.
Amy, bring in the walking and biking perspective, if you could, to tell us about walk zones and, the safety for kids walking and biking, and how frankly, well, this is a very leading question, so take it away. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing about walk zones, so that is all determined by MPS. And I think there was actually a recent update kind of with the whole redistricting that's going to happen, an update to the walk zones. I think they're adding in violent crime and traffic safety kind of into their model, looking at walk zones. There's one thing for elementary schools specifically. I think they identified major roads with 5,000 or more cars per day is considered a potentially hazardous barrier when looking at those walk zones. When it comes to some of the work that we do at the city, we definitely take a very data-driven approach to identifying those safe routes to school. And so back in 2014, I believe, Minneapolis Public Works and MPS had a collaboration to create the Walking Routes for Youth map, which wasn't just about safe routes to school, but also how do you safely navigate your neighborhoods, parks, rec centers, different amenities throughout the neighborhood. And so for a long time, that was kind of used as the initial blueprint of identifying routes that we would make infrastructure improvements for safe routes to school projects. With the new transportation action plan that came out, there's the updated All Ages and Ability Network, which is kind of that shifting. There's a lot of similar routes on there, but it's kind of shifting that. And so we look at that policy document as kind of a foundation of routes that we can look at and where those safety improvements need to happen. And kind of once those routes are determined, obviously there's a lot more to it. There's a lot of engagement that happens with that as well. But really digging into the data in terms of kind of those, what are the speeds or volumes of the streets? What are the crash data? Where are some of those high risk intersections? And that really speaks to what types of improvements need to happen along those routes. And so we really take a policy and data-driven approach to help determine those routes and try to not only create safe routes for students to walk and bike to school, but also just to safely navigate neighborhoods.
Great. Great. And my leading question was going to be just having more people, parents, families driving their kids to school leads to, I believe, and confirm if this is not true, but more congestion, more vehicles around a school inherently makes it less safe for people walking and biking.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of traffic safety risks that you have to look at, and congestion, so health issues there as well. And so I think you even look at increased people dropping off their students. How does that interact with the bus operations? And you have a lot more people maybe not where they typically are. And so just how all of those operations impact each other around the schools. I think there's a lot of safety risks there as well. One thing I do want to note, you look at the recent transportation action plan that was adopted, and we have a mode shift goal of 3 of every 5 trips to be taken by walking, biking, or transit. And then you overlay it with this pandemic with a lot more people driving and still trying to reach those mode shift goals. I think it's something that is a really difficult problem and challenge of how we can still reach those goals, because those goals are in place because of safety and health, a whole slew of reasons of why that goal exists. And I think talking about the traffic safety around schools specifically and having more people driving, I think is a really important aspect to that.
Absolutely. We've got some great questions coming in. So I think just a note to my panelists that I think let's skip the historical one and let's go right to this. I have a question for you all about the 15-minute city, and I want to set the stage for it. And hopefully I don't click the wrong thing here. Just a moment. I have a slide to share on that. Give me one moment while I attempt to pull it up. And that's Tom's from before. Okay, so the 15-minute city. Even with 2 screens, I think I need 3, I've decided. All right, so this concept of the 15-minute city, I want to hear your feedback on. So it's an idea born out of Paris, which is why everything is in French on this slide. But the idea is to improve quality of life by creating cities where everything a resident needs can be reached within a quarter of an hour by foot or by bike. And this 15-minute city requires minimal travel, and you can kind of see it with these little icons and on the screen, where you can get from housing and to offices, to restaurants, to parks, to hospitals, cultural venues. So something I've noticed is that the 15-minute city concept, I've heard very little about schools in here, but so I want to bring it up though. How can we use the concept of the 15-minute city to create schools that people want to go to? And how does it even apply to schools? So, something that comes to mind, what is the cost for busing now? And how would the idea of a 15-minute city impact costs, if all? I realize those are a lot of questions. So anyway, take it away. All of that, I'm curious about this concept.
So I can provide some information into that. With the district redesign for the upcoming school year. I think from the transportation standpoint, just with all the changes that are going to happen then on the form of academics, equity, and sustainability, I guess with the transportation view, the goal is to shorten rides for students across the city, whether students are attending to a community school or to a citywide program. And essentially those are going to be, for example, citywide programs, rides are going to be 45 or less. Community schools are going to be 50 minutes or less, right? And then with determined walking zones, and also definitely there's going to be a improvement on the transportation distance and student ridership, as well as a services available for all of our families and communities, right? Essentially trying to provide a safe and welcoming environment for all students and family, equitable access to academically rigorous and culturally relevant programming, such as like STEM or dual language immersion, to give you examples.
Great. And Tom, cost of busing. Tell us
and
your experience.
Yeah, so there's not an easy answer to that because so much is dependent on all the details. And because theoretically it makes sense, it should save money. One of the biggest problems we have right now is a shortage of drivers and bus assistants too for special needs buses, things like that. And it's an ongoing struggle. And so what you're looking at is how do you get the most efficiency off each particular bus, which means keeping it on the road as much as possible and then serving multiple tiers of students. And then you get the driver, it's a better job for the driver, gets them a better day's pay, less downtime in between, and makes good use of that bus, which is not cheap either. And so in trying to gather all these efficiencies, you're struggling with the youngest kids being out in the dark very early in the morning as we try to get the high schoolers to a later tier to more fit their circadian rhythm. And there's all kinds of factors, but then it comes down to, with the concept of a 15-minute city, then how many kids can now bicycle or walk to school, keeping in mind that it was 20 below degree zero last night or whatever it was, that there's factors in Minnesota and Minneapolis that usually they're not struggling with in Austin, Texas, but this morning they are. But so there's just so many different factors. It's really hard to say. I do know I went through this kind of with St. Paul Public Schools to a degree similar to what Minneapolis is doing now, trying to take a more regional approach and offering services in different areas of the city. So children can go to a school nearer their home, which allows for better family engagement, better community engagement, and hopefully a better outcome. And so, the goal was very clearly not to save money on transportation. Hopefully that's a side effect of it, a byproduct of it. And so, and looking at, I'm not quite as familiar with Minneapolis's, but I think to me, it's a step in the right direction. Very painful process for families and school staff to go through. And I think ultimately in the end, it'll be a better product and closer to this concept of the 15-minute city, which I think is really where we need to be going. And so I think it's really hard to assign, is it going to save money or cost more money? But I think it's the right direction to go in. And ultimately I would be hopeful it could save money.
Great. Amy.
Yeah, I would add that I think there's really good points about the new redistricting that's happening, or the restructuring. And I think this emphasis on more community schools and being able to live and be closer to your school is great, just not even and I'm thinking about it more in terms of walking and biking, and students be able to do that and have the social benefits and the health benefits of being able to do that. Which is great. You think about students going to school within their neighborhood. Theoretically, they're going to school with other students in their neighborhood. They're building those relationships and able to kind of really build that community, which I think is really important. And in terms of kind of the work that my group does is the infrastructure piece of that. And I think there's something really important to say about, in order to have that 15-minute city of people being able to walk and bike, you need that safe infrastructure for people to actually want to do that and to feel safe to do that. Which I think there's this idea of walking school buses that people have done, different safe routes to school programs. And I think if you look at the 15-minute city, that could be a really cool idea. Having these community schools, maybe people living on the same block or a few blocks, they could all meet up and have a walking school bus to school. You either have a parent volunteer or something like that, a school staff member. And I think it provides a little extra safety and security. You're in a group rather than walking alone, but also providing that social benefit and building that community. I think there's a lot of benefits that could happen by just having a closer community right there.
That the walking school bus sort of makes me think about Ale, your experience with families chipping in to essentially form a school bus to get you to school, and just sort of flipping that idea on its head. Well, great. Well, the last question that I have for you, and then I'm going to open it up to the general audience. I want to ask you, how do we get to a greener future faster? You know, it's sort of, I'm hearing from you that maybe we're even slipping. So how do we change the trend and then accelerate the benefits of all the things that we already know, and how do we make that happen?
Well, one of the things I saw, I saw in the chat, someone asked about basically the proximity of how the parents are driving the kids right up to the schools, making it a lot of traffic around the schools. One of the things that's nice about the school bus is the drivers are trained. We can enforce them approaching the school in a certain way, stopping on a certain side of the school, it's much more difficult, Ale, you could attest to this, much more difficult to manage parents who are more likely, and it may be an aunt today dropping the child off, and maybe a neighbor who doesn't know where they're supposed to be. And so it's very difficult to manage that family traffic taking their own children to school. And so I do think one of the things, we've made it really easy, and it's a challenging thing for a school principal to come down hard on parents who are driving their child to school. And so it's a really challenging thing to manage. And I think you see this out there, and Ali too. It's very challenging to manage that parent traffic around the buildings. And so if it was less convenient, it would probably be helpful. But then the principal has to deal with that backlash, where parents are not understanding why this is so difficult. Why can't I just drive up to the door and drop them off? And as parents, we want to see our child get safely into the building. It's really hard for a parent to drop them down the block and trust they're just going to get in while school staff is hurrying them along. Okay, get out, we got another car coming. And so it's a difficult equation.
Yeah, and I share the same thought. Just you become almost like the traffic control of the parking lot of the school, and you're in the position of making decisions or having tough conversation with families where their view is, I'm just dropping out my child, but you're not letting me get off the car, you're not letting me park. It's not that we don't let you, it's just that we want for the queue to move, and essentially everyone to get breakfast in time for class. Kids just get in time to where they need to be and start the day as soon as they need to, right? I guess from the transportation standpoint, part of the reason why I was brought on board, it was to create that source of communication between schools and the transportation department. One of the things that we would like to start doing, and we kind of virtually, is to create that awareness for families to how to safely ride the bus, right? I guess sometimes maybe families choose different sort of transportation because they don't know what it is to ride the bus, right? Or how am I going to get my kid into the bus, or who is involved, or how is the driver going to keep my student safely on the bus, or how does drop off happen in school when this, and I think the more awareness that we can create in different languages, and more inclusive we create that information, I think they can be a more positive impact amongst our communities in providing that information for them, and essentially giving that peace of mind that how the school ride happens.
Do you think providing that information for walking and biking would well, where does that fit in? Maybe Amy, is that something you see schools doing to kind of as one of the strategies to kind of lead with this virtuous cycle of parent communication around different options?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what schools have done that, but I feel like I've definitely seen materials like that. I'm trying to encourage that, and thinking about schools that have gotten planning grants to create a safe routes to school plan for their school specifically. I know definitely do that. There's also these mobile bike fleets that go in between schools too, that teach kids how to ride bikes. They do different field trips, riding a bike to different locations. I think there's a lot of great work that has been going on. There's a program called Walk Bike Fun that MPS does to help educate and encourage students to choose an active form of transportation. But I think there's a lot of challenges to getting to students to actually do that because of the safety implications, or just even the cultural norms around how you do typically get to school. And I think it's a really challenging question. And I think about our work kind of at the city, the role that I'm in, and we're more on kind of the capital, the infrastructure piece of it, and looking at how long those projects really take to implement in terms of getting safer improvements on the streets, which is just one piece of the puzzle of getting students to choose active transportation to and from school. And so, like, our typical process currently is that you start an engagement about 2 years before a project might be implemented. There's a lot of the length of a project is very extensive, which there's reasons for that, to do your due diligence, making sure you're connecting with the community, hearing that input, but also there's a lot of details in terms of the engineering aspects that go into building infrastructure. And so there's challenges in terms of getting things done quickly, which I mean, you can go into it, trends change in a number of years. What's important right now, the behaviors might be shifting 2 years from now when the project's actually implemented. And so I think there's a lot of challenges to how we actually get to a greener future faster. And I think one thing that the city has started to do is these quick build projects. And I think I saw in the chat too, somebody asking the question about closing off the streets for shared streets around schools for pickup drop off. And I know that's not something that we typically do right now, but I think there's kind of the point in time that we're at. I think we really need to start thinking a little bit outside the box, a little bit more creatively about how we can encourage safer modes of transportation to and from school and around schools. And I think the quick build is an option for that. You can get something in the ground quickly, see if it's working effectively. That can inform future infrastructure projects to make sure that that it's actually having the impacts that you think it would. But I think there's so many challenges that go into it, whether it's funding, it's the engineering, it's the engagement process. There's a lot. Behavior change, I think that's the biggest hurdle actually in getting people to walk and bike to school. But yeah, it's a hard thing.
And that's why we're all together today. So I'm glad we're able to talk about it. I just want to make a note that you mentioned the school streets, and I believe that's the one in the chat, the Minnesota Safe Routes to School Streets Park Walk PDF. Thank you, Wendy, for putting that in the chat, and we'll make sure we get that out to everybody who's attending today's webinar. So I want to go to the audience questions, and we've got one from Mary, an equity question, very important equity piece to the school. What does it mean really to live in a community that's not served by transit, and to have a car to drive your kid to school and then drive yourself to a job that's not served by transit? So if anybody, open it up, whoever would like to, what's that make you think of? If you'd like to respond to that.
I do think that's a very real concern, and I appreciate you bringing that up. It's very difficult, especially this comes down to a timing thing. And what I talked about early on with my experience being able to ride the city bus, having that as a good option that I could participate in athletics. It's the same thing for a family where they need to get to work. The timing just doesn't work to wait on the bus stop with their child and then get to work. And so it may be easier and work better to drop the child off at school in their own personal vehicle and then drive to work. And it gives options that they just don't have with the school bus. And then whether they feel safe with their child standing waiting alone on the corner, is there anyone there at the end of the day to pick the child up? So there's a lot of very real equity issues here around just this. And I think we do need to address that, and how do we figure out how do we address that?
It's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to respond to that? Otherwise, we can keep going. We've got, oh my gosh, we have so many questions in the chat. All right. So we've got one. Thanks, Eric, for your question. I'm going to read it out loud. What kind of outreach have you done for families from diverse cultures who might not trust buses, or even bike culture for their students? Eric worked as a transportation coordinator in Minneapolis Public Schools, and it was hard to change behaviors, again, alluding to what you mentioned, Amy, hard to change behaviors for students who might be willing to try different transportation modes when their parents might not feel safe about that. Who could create that culturally responsive toolkit and engagement process? Where might be a good home for it?
So I'll answer to that, Amy. So what myself and there's also a colleague of mine, we were came on board just recently to transportation. Part of the training that we've created just recently for drivers is an SEL training, social emotional awareness. We're calling it for them, and just bringing that perspective of a moving classroom. That's what we're calling it. We want to transform that idea of it's just transportation, but rather a moving classroom, and bringing that perspective to drivers of social emotional learning, awareness, customer service for students. How does that look like? Right? It's a different clientele, right? Just because of the emotions, the different forms of communication, all the challenges that our communities face day to day, just presenting that to them, and so they are aware of their customers, their needs, and more so right now during COVID, that we've been at home, all of us, right? And we're bringing all of that into the bus. They themselves have emotions that they have to be aware to, and how does that impact students? This is something we've never done at transportation, so I'm proud of exposing this and bringing this, that we just want them to be more prepared to how the students are coming now, right? As far as the outreach, we've met with some families, parent councils. We met with the Latino council. We met with the Somali, the Hmong. So we're really trying to outreach and create that awareness. This is something that we haven't done in the past, so it's something new. We hope that when we can all be together, we do it in person, but for now we're just doing it virtually with the communities.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So what about teachers and school staff? I want to recognize that we really didn't touch on that today. That's I feel like that's a whole topic in and of itself. They drive a lot to school because they can't, our writer Barbara writes in, because they can't afford to live near the school, or maybe they've, I'm willing to guess that teachers transfer within schools, within the district. So what's being done to support them? And anybody can, I realize that not necessarily the focus of this webinar, but definitely something that could be talked about more. Any thoughts there? Okay, well, I will just jump in, coming from the employer perspective, and I just want to say that Minneapolis Public Schools did pass a resolution. I believe it was back in 2012, to saying that they support alternative transportation for staff members, and I'll make sure that gets included within the post-webinar email. I don't have a link to it at the moment, but I believe it's something that has been thought about within Minneapolis Public Schools. So let's see, we're now at 12:55, and I would like to ask my esteemed group here today if you have any final words that you'd like to share. I think we'll pause on questions unless there's a question you would like to respond to within the chat.
I'll just hop in and say that I'm super happy that this is a conversation that's being had, because we are at such a crucial moment where schools are reopening up, and what does that mean? And I think there's not just in terms of how it impacts students, but the broader Minneapolis and the region in terms of transportation goals. I think it's really important that we're thinking about how we can get people to where they need to be safely and effectively and the most healthy way possible. So I'm just glad that this conversation is happening, and I hope that it continues. And if we see this be a continued trend into the years to follow, that we really think about reallocating resources to do something more about it. I think it's very important.
Thanks, Amy. Ollie or Tom?
Thank you for the invitation, Amy. I'm happy that I can share all this information with the community and just also hear new information, and definitely continue, just share the same feelings as Amy, continue this conversation just for the hope that we can improve services, improve quality of life for the city of Minneapolis and surrounding areas, our students, our community, and definitely our families.
Great. Well, oh, go
I've
ahead.
got a couple of things from the chat actually that will be my final thing too, is just the idea that of selling people on this, of doing PR around alternative ways of getting to school. And I don't think we do that, and talking about, a culturally responsive toolkit and things like that. That's really not part of it. And it's a difficult thing to put on the schools at this point, but it is a very proactive approach that I think we as a society need to figure out. How do we encourage and educate people in this way when that's really not happening in a large scale?
Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate you taking the time today to share your insight on this. And we will, thank you to our audience members. We will have a email out with all the links, contact information for our three panelists, and really, really, really sincerely appreciate it. Thank you, Ali, Tom, and Amy. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.